When darkness feels overwhelming and sleep remains elusive, Genesis reveals how God's first act was to separate light from darkness. This ancient story holds profound wisdom for those seeking peace tonight. What if the same divine command that brought order to chaos could bring calm to your restless mind? Before anything existed, the universe was formless and void, a state described in Genesis as a dark expanse over deep waters. This primordial chaos mirrors what happens in your mind when sleep escapes you, when thoughts wander without direction or purpose through endless corridors of worry and recollection. Your restless mind knows this formlessness well. The unchecked procession of tasks left undone, conversations replaying, future scenarios unfolding without resolution. Unstructured mental space often feels threatening because it lacks boundaries, leaving you exposed to whatever anxieties may surface without the distraction of daily focus to contain them. Neuroscience reveals that during unstructured rest, your brain's default mode network activates, a system that becomes particularly active when you're not focused on external tasks. This network processes self-referential thoughts, memories, and future planning, which explains why lying in bed without the structure of daytime activities can become a breeding ground for anxiety rather than restoration. You might notice how your thoughts jump from work deadlines to relationship concerns to physical discomfort, creating a swirling mental environment where no single worry resolves before another appears. This mental formlessness echoes the primordial waters before creation, where everything existed in potential but nothing held distinct shape or purpose. Yet into this ancient chaos came a voice speaking order, not by eliminating the darkness, but by distinguishing light from it. The divine command, "Let there be light," did not erase the formless void, but established distinction within it, creating the first separation that would make all subsequent creation possible. This first act of separation reveals that order begins with distinction rather than elimination. The same principle applies to your mental landscape, where creating boundaries between productive thought and anxious spiraling can establish the foundation for peace. The divine intervention was not to remove the chaotic elements, but to define their proper places and functions. That initial separation established the fundamental truth that order can emerge from even the deepest chaos when proper distinctions are made. Your mind, like the primordial creation, contains both the capacity for disorder and the inherent potential for divine order to be spoken into it. The distinction between light and darkness created the first rhythm, the alternating pattern that would govern all of creation's cycles. This foundational separation demonstrates that rhythm itself begins with clear differentiation, a principle that applies to your sleep cycles, your thought patterns, and your ability to find rest amid life's demands. What began as formless potential became ordered reality through the simple act of separation, proving that chaos contains within itself the seeds of organization when proper distinctions are established. This ancient pattern continues to operate. Whenever order emerges from disorder, whether in cosmic creation or personal restoration, the separation of light from darkness was not merely a physical act but a spiritual precedent, showing how divine intervention operates by bringing distinction to what was previously undifferentiated. This same principle applies to your mental and emotional life, where creating clear boundaries allows peace to emerge from turmoil. That first creative act established that darkness and light each have their proper place and purpose, neither needing to eliminate the other, but both operating within defined boundaries. This divine model of coexistence through separation offers a paradigm for managing the contrasting elements within your own experience. After the separation of light from darkness, something remarkable occurred that established a pattern modern culture has largely forgotten. God saw that the light was good. This declaration became a recurring theme throughout the creation narrative, appearing after each major creative act as a divine affirmation of completion and inherent value. The repeated phrase, "God saw that it was good," signifies more than mere approval. It represents a theological principle that creation in its individual parts and entirety was inherently right and met God's perfect standard. This divine pattern of completion contrasts sharply with human experience, where we rarely acknowledge when something is truly finished. You move from task to task without pausing to recognize completion, treating each accomplishment as merely a stepping stone to the next obligation. Your work emails spill into family time, your household chores extend into rest hours, and your mental to-do list continues scrolling long after you lie down. This perpetual striving creates a state of constant dissatisfaction where nothing ever feels truly complete or good enough to warrant cessation. The psychological phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect explains why unfinished tasks occupy your mind more persistently than completed ones. Your brain maintains heightened awareness of incomplete activities, creating mental unrest that directly interferes with your ability to relax and transition into sleep. When you fail to consciously recognize task completion, your mind remains burdened by a sense of ongoing obligation, manifesting as intrusive thoughts about unfinished business and a pervasive feeling of not having accomplished enough. Each divine declaration of goodness established a rhythm where work was followed by validation rather than immediately proceeding to the next project. This pattern created psychological endpoints that modern productivity culture systematically eliminates through endless notifications, escalating performance expectations, and the illusion that more can always be accomplished. The cumulative effect of these declarations builds toward the ultimate affirmation that everything God had made was very good, establishing that completion precedes rest rather than exhaustion. The creation narrative presents a divine rhythm where periods of intense creative effort are meant to be followed by sanctified cessation. The repeated affirmation of goodness validates completed work, making subsequent rest not an indication of laziness, but a holy acknowledgement of a job well done. This theological framework offers a counter-narrative to anxiety-driven productivity, suggesting that true fulfillment comes from recognizing the inherent goodness of completed work rather than endless striving. Scientific research confirms that acknowledging task completion, even in small ways, significantly improves mental health by fostering a sense of accomplishment and reducing stress. Conscious recognition that a task is finished provides a psychological endpoint that alleviates the pressure of ongoing work, leading to increased satisfaction and a more relaxed state conducive to sleep. This scientific observation aligns with the ancient wisdom of the creation account, where each declaration of goodness created the conditions for what would come next. The pattern teaches that cessation requires acknowledging that something is already complete and worthy of being called good. This principle transforms your relationship with work and rest, suggesting that peace comes not from exhausting yourself, but from recognizing the inherent value in what has been accomplished. The divine model demonstrates that rest follows completion, not collapse, establishing a sustainable rhythm for human existence. This rhythm of declared goodness establishes the foundation for what would become the markers of time. The celestial bodies created not merely for light, but for defining seasons, days, and years. The Genesis account reveals that God's initial creative act was not forming matter from nothing, but rather separating what already existed, distinguishing light from darkness. This fundamental act of division established the foundational principle that divine order begins with distinction rather than creation ex nihilo, setting a pattern for how God would structure the cosmos through careful differentiation and organization of existing elements. The separation of light from darkness represents the genesis of rhythm itself, introducing the alternating pattern that would govern all subsequent cycles of creation. You often approach your own internal struggles with a different strategy, attempting to eliminate difficult thoughts or emotions rather than learning to distinguish them from your core identity. When anxiety surfaces at night, you might try to suppress the worrying thoughts or force them away through sheer willpower, creating an internal battle that paradoxically amplifies the very thoughts you wish to eliminate. This approach mirrors trying to abolish darkness rather than recognizing its proper place within the larger rhythm of light and darkness. Sleep itself requires accepting both wakefulness and rest as necessary parts of the human experience. Just as day and night each serve distinct purposes in the natural world, your waking hours and sleeping hours each contribute to your overall well-being in ways that cannot be reduced to mere opposition. The attempt to force sleep through exhaustion or medication often backfires because it fails to honor the natural distinction between these two states, treating them as enemies rather than complementary partners in your daily rhythm. Scientific research on circadian rhythms demonstrates how your body's natural 24-hour cycle regulates sleep and wakefulness through light-sensitive mechanisms. These biological processes align with the spiritual principle established in Genesis, showing that health emerges from respecting the distinction between periods of activity and rest, rather than attempting to eliminate one in favor of the other. When artificial light disrupts these natural rhythms, the consequences extend beyond sleep disturbances to affect mood, cognitive function, and overall physical health. The same principle applies to managing intrusive thoughts that interfere with sleep. Psychological research indicates that attempting to suppress unwanted thoughts often makes them more persistent, while acknowledging and distinguishing these thoughts from your core self creates the mental space needed for peace. This approach reflects the divine method of bringing order through distinction rather than elimination, allowing you to coexist with difficult mental states without being controlled by them. This foundational separation established that rhythm begins with clear differentiation, creating the template for all subsequent cycles in creation. The distinction between light and darkness made possible the alternating pattern of day and night that would govern plant growth, animal behavior, and ultimately human activity. This principle extends beyond the physical realm to influence how you structure your time, manage your thoughts, and approach your spiritual practices. Divine order emerges through distinction, not elimination, offering a crucial insight for managing anxious thoughts and emotional turmoil. Rather than trying to eradicate what feels threatening or uncomfortable, the creation pattern suggests creating clear boundaries that allow different elements to exist in their proper places. This approach transforms your relationship with internal chaos, moving from confrontation to structured coexistence. The separation of light from darkness established that both elements have their proper place and purpose within God's creation. Darkness was not eliminated, but given its own domain and function, just as night serves essential purposes for restoration, growth, and renewal in the natural world. This theological understanding challenges the tendency to view difficulties as problems to be solved rather than realities, to be properly positioned within a larger framework of meaning. This initial act of separation created the conditions for all subsequent creative work, demonstrating that order emerges through proper distinction rather than through the removal of challenging elements. The divine pattern shows that peace comes not from eliminating what disturbs you, but from learning to distinguish it from your core identity and giving it its proper place within your experience. The separation of light from darkness established the theological foundation for understanding how God brings order to chaos through differentiation rather than destruction. This principle continues to operate whenever structure emerges from disorder, whether in the cosmos, in human society, or within your own mind as you seek rest amid life's complexities. This act of distinction created the first boundary within creation, establishing the pattern that would continue with the separation of waters above from waters below, land from sea, and ultimately humanity from the rest of creation. The establishment of boundaries through distinction rather than elimination reveals that divine order operates through proper placement rather than through the removal of what seems problematic or challenging. On the second day of creation, God established the firmament, a boundary that separated the waters above from the waters below. This divine act created a defined space between the chaotic waters, establishing order through careful separation rather than elimination. The firmament represents a theological principle that boundaries established by God create safety and structure rather than restriction, forming a protected environment where life could eventually flourish. This ancient concept of the firmament as a solid dome holding back chaotic waters reveals how divine limits operate to create habitable spaces within what would otherwise be overwhelming. You often resist boundaries in your own life, viewing them as limitations rather than protections. The tendency to blur lines between work and rest, between productivity and restoration, creates a formless mental environment where anxiety can flow freely across all areas of life. When you check emails in bed or mentally rehearse tomorrow's meetings while trying to sleep, you eliminate the firmament that should separate your waking concerns from your resting hours. This resistance to boundaries mirrors humanity's historical struggle with divine limits, where we perceive restriction rather than protection. Sleep requires creating psychological boundaries that separate the day's concerns from the night's restoration. Just as the firmament held back chaotic waters to create a safe space for life, you need to establish mental boundaries that prevent the waters of anxiety from flooding your rest. This might involve a clear end to your workday, a technology cutoff time, or a simple ritual that signals to your mind that the time for productive striving has ceased and the time for receptive rest has begun. Scientific research confirms that clear boundaries between work and rest significantly reduce anxiety and improve sleep quality. When you establish consistent routines that separate your waking activities from your sleeping hours, you create psychological safety that allows your nervous system to transition from sympathetic activation to parasympathetic rest. The inability to create these boundaries often results in prolonged sleep latency, frequent awakenings, and reduced sleep efficiency, as your mind continues processing daytime concerns, rather than entering restorative states. The firmament established not merely a separation but a protected space where life could develop, free from the threat of overwhelming chaos. This divine boundary making created the necessary conditions for the subsequent creation of land, plants, and living creatures. The establishment of this ordered space demonstrates that boundaries are not limitations, but rather the necessary framework within which growth and flourishing become possible. Without the firmament's protective separation, the creative work that followed would have been impossible. Divinely established boundaries create safety rather than restriction, offering a framework within which true freedom can operate. The firmament did not limit God's creation, but made it possible by providing a stable environment protected from chaotic forces. This principle applies to your sleep patterns, where clear boundaries around rest create the safety needed for deep restoration rather than representing limitations on your productivity or availability. The creation of the firmament preceded the provision of sustenance, establishing that safe space must exist before provision can be received. This order of operations reveals that boundaries create the container into which nourishment can be poured, whether that nourishment takes the form of physical provision, emotional support, or spiritual sustenance. The establishment of secure boundaries makes possible the receiving of what is needed for growth and flourishing. This divine pattern demonstrates that boundaries are foundational rather than secondary, creating the structural integrity that allows life to develop without being overwhelmed by chaos. The firmament's establishment on the second day, before the creation of land and vegetation, shows that proper boundaries must precede the provision of sustenance, creating the safe space into which nourishment can be received and utilized effectively. On the third day, God commanded the earth to bring forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and trees bearing fruit, established before any creatures existed to consume them. This act demonstrates divine provision that anticipates need, showing how God's care operates through foresight rather than reaction. The creation of sustenance before the creation of those who would require it establishes a theological principle of abundant preparation, revealing that divine generosity operates on a different timetable than human anxiety. Your worry about tomorrow's needs often disrupts tonight's rest as your mind rehearses future scenarios and calculates potential shortages. This mental preoccupation with what might be lacking tomorrow keeps you from receiving the rest available tonight, creating a cycle where anxiety about future provision prevents present restoration. You might lie awake calculating financial obligations, professional responsibilities, or relational concerns, treating sleep as a luxury you cannot afford rather than a necessity you've been provided. This anticipatory anxiety activates your body's stress response system, elevating cortisol levels that interfere with natural sleep rhythms. When cortisol remains elevated in the evening, it disrupts the body's natural decline that should facilitate sleep initiation and maintenance. The physiological state of alertness triggered by worry about future needs makes genuine rest impossible, as your body remains prepared for perceived threats rather than entering restorative states. Scientific research confirms that trust significantly reduces cortisol levels and improves sleep quality. When you cultivate a mindset of trust, particularly in a benevolent higher power, it downregulates the sympathetic nervous system and allows the parasympathetic system to dominate, creating the physiological conditions necessary for rest. This shift from stress response to relaxation response demonstrates how spiritual trust manifests in physical restoration. The preemptive creation of vegetation establishes that rest becomes possible when we trust in prior provision rather than striving to secure future needs through wakeful anxiety. God's act of providing sustenance before it was needed models a different approach to existence, one based on receiving what has already been prepared rather than anxiously working to secure what might be needed later. This divine pattern challenges the assumption that vigilance produces security, suggesting instead that trust in prior provision creates the conditions for true rest. Your struggle to sleep often stems from operating as if provision depends on your continued vigilance, rather than on what has already been established. The creation narrative reverses this assumption, showing that the necessary resources for life were already in place before life itself began. This theological insight transforms your relationship with rest, suggesting that sleep becomes possible when you trust that what you need has already been provided rather than depending on your wakefulness to secure it. The relationship between provision and rest becomes clear in this divine sequence. Vegetation created on the third day, followed by the creation of celestial timekeepers on the fourth day. This order demonstrates that provision precedes rhythm, establishing that the regularity of days and seasons operates within a context of abundant sustenance rather than scarcity. The same principle applies to your sleep patterns, where trust in provision creates the psychological safety needed for regular, restorative rest. This anticipatory provision establishes that your needs are met within a framework of generosity rather than scarcity, transforming how you approach both waking hours and sleeping hours. When you trust that what you require has already been prepared, your nervous system can relax its vigilant monitoring of potential threats, allowing natural sleep rhythms to emerge without artificial inducement or anxious effort. The creation of vegetation before creatures reveals that divine provision operates through abundance rather than rationing, through generosity rather than scarcity. This theological reality challenges the anxiety-driven perception that resources are limited and must be secured through constant effort, offering instead a vision of creation where what is needed has already been provided before the need arises. This pattern of anticipatory provision establishes the foundation for the rhythms that would follow, creating a world where celestial markers could govern time within the context of already established sustenance. The provision of vegetation made possible the regular cycles of growth and harvest that would characterize life on Earth, demonstrating how divine foresight creates the conditions for sustainable rhythms rather than desperate striving. On the fourth day, God established the sun, moon, and stars not merely to provide light, but to serve as celestial timekeepers that would govern day and night, marking seasons, days, and years. These heavenly bodies were created with the specific purpose of establishing cosmic rhythm, providing a predictable framework within which life could flourish according to divinely ordained patterns rather than chaotic randomness. The creation narrative explicitly presents these celestial bodies as having governing functions, with the greater light ruling the day and the lesser light ruling the night. establishing a theological understanding of time as ordered and purposeful rather than arbitrary or oppressive. Your modern existence operates under artificial lighting that disrupts these natural rhythms, creating a disconnect between your biological programming and your environmental conditions. The constant availability of artificial light, particularly from electronic devices, extends your waking hours beyond what nature intended, blurring the boundaries between day and night that your body was designed to recognize. This technological advancement, while offering convenience, creates a fundamental tension with your innate circadian rhythms that evolved to respond to natural light-dark cycles. The blue light emitted from screens signals to your brain that it remains daytime, suppressing melatonin production and delaying sleep onset. This hormonal disruption interferes with your body's natural transition into restorative states, leaving you in a state of hyper-arousal when you should be winding down for sleep. Scientific research confirms that artificial light exposure in the evening hours significantly impacts sleep quality by confusing your internal biological clock, which remains attuned to the natural rhythms established at creation. This disruption represents a deeper spiritual disconnect from the divine pattern where time operates as a gift rather than a commodity to be maximized. Modern productivity culture often views time as a scarce resource to be managed and optimized, creating anxiety about wasting moments that should instead be viewed as opportunities for receiving restoration. The constant pressure to utilize every waking minute productively creates a mentality where rest feels like theft rather than provision, where sleep becomes a necessary interruption rather than an integral part of the rhythm. The cosmic rhythm established by celestial bodies demonstrates that time is structured for your benefit rather than your constraint. The predictable cycles of day and night, seasons and years provide a framework within which you can plan, work and rest without anxiety about the passage of time itself. These rhythms enable rather than restrict, creating boundaries that protect your need for both activity and restoration rather than demanding constant productivity. The creation of time markers before the creation of life shows that rhythm precedes existence, establishing that life flourishes within structured time rather than in opposition to it. This divine order suggests that your well-being depends on aligning with these natural rhythms rather than resisting them through artificial illumination and round-the-clock productivity. The same principle applies to your sleep patterns, where respecting natural light-dark cycles creates the conditions for restorative rest rather than fragmented sleep. This understanding transforms your relationship with time from one of scarcity to one of abundance, where each period, whether for work or rest, has its proper place and purpose. The celestial timekeepers establish that time is a divine provision rather than a human possession, a gift to be received within its proper boundaries rather than a resource to be exploited without limits. The rhythm established by sun, moon and stars creates the necessary conditions for what would follow, the abundant life that would fill the skies, waters and land. On the fifth day, God commanded the waters to teem with living creatures and the skies to fill with birds, establishing a divine principle that created spaces are meant for habitation rather than emptiness. This act of filling represents more than biological multiplication. It reveals God's nature as abundantly generative, desiring fullness and vitality where void once existed. The command to be fruitful and multiply extends beyond mere reproduction to signify the expansion of God's goodness and order throughout creation. This divine imperative stands in stark contrast to the initial formless void, demonstrating that God's intention is for creation to express its full potential within established boundaries. You often operate from a scarcity mindset that views resources, time and opportunities as limited commodities requiring constant vigilance and effort. This perception of lack drives overwork and hypervigilance, creating a state where rest feels like a risky indulgence rather than a divine provision. When you believe there might not be enough, whether financially, professionally, or relationally, your nervous system remains in a heightened state of alert, preparing to compete for perceived limited resources rather than operating from a place of trust in abundant provision. Scarcity. Thinking prevents restful sleep by keeping your mind engaged in perpetual calculation and anxiety about potential future lacks. You might lie awake mentally inventorying your resources, strategizing how to secure more, or fearing that what you have will prove insufficient. This mental activity activates your sympathetic nervous system, releasing stress hormones that interfere with natural sleep initiation and maintenance. The fear of not having enough creates a physiological state incompatible with the parasympathetic dominance required for restorative rest. Scientific research confirms that an abundance mentality significantly impacts parasympathetic nervous system activation, creating the physiological conditions necessary for relaxation and sleep. When you operate from trust in sufficient provision, your body reduces cortisol production and increases heart rate variability, signaling safety to your nervous system. This shift from stress response to relaxation response allows your body to enter restorative states more easily, improving both sleep onset and sleep quality. The neurological correlates of abundance thinking show reduced amygdala activity and increased activation in brain regions associated with calm and well-being. The filling of created spaces with abundant life demonstrates that rest follows adequate provision rather than exhaustion. The waters and skies were filled with creatures only after the environment had been prepared to sustain them, establishing that abundance emerges from prior provision rather than anxious striving. This divine pattern suggests that true rest becomes possible when you trust that what you need has already been provided, allowing your nervous system to transition from vigilant protection to receptive restoration. This understanding transforms your approach to sleep from something you must fight to achieve through exhaustion to something you can receive as the natural consequence of adequate provision. The creation of abundant life shows that the universe operates from generosity rather than scarcity, offering a model for how you might approach your own need for rest, not as a scarce resource to be seized through collapse, but as a regular rhythm to be received within the context of divine provision. The teeming waters and filled skies establish that creation is designed for fullness rather than emptiness, for abundance rather than lack. This theological reality challenges the anxiety-driven perception that you must constantly strive to secure what you need, offering instead a vision of existence where provision precedes need and rest follows provision rather than exhaustion. The abundant life created on the fifth day prepares the way for what would follow, the creation of land animals and humanity that would complete the inhabitation of the prepared spaces. This progression toward fullness establishes that divine creation moves toward completion and abundance rather than scarcity and lack, creating the conditions for the ultimate declaration that everything God had made was very good. Humanity emerged as the culmination of creation, not primarily for functional capacity, but as bearers of God's image, created to reflect divine nature through relationship rather than performance. The Imago Dei establishes your worth as inherent rather than earned, grounding your identity in being rather than doing. This theological reality stands in direct opposition to modern culture's emphasis on productivity as the measure of human value, where your accomplishments dictate your significance and your output determines your worth. You live in a world that constantly measures your value by what you produce, how much you achieve, and what you contribute to the economy or society. This performance-based mindset infiltrates your self-perception, creating a sense that you must continually prove your worth through visible accomplishments. When you lie awake at night, this anxiety often manifests as mental calculations of your daily productivity, regrets about unfinished tasks, or fears about not meeting tomorrow's expectations. Your inability to shut down this mental accounting reflects the deeper struggle with believing your value exists independently of your output. Insomnia frequently stems from this identity anxiety, where your mind cannot rest because your sense of self feels threatened by the cessation of productive activity. The transition into sleep represents a temporary suspension of your ability to demonstrate worth through action, creating subconscious resistance to surrendering consciousness. You might notice how sleep becomes more elusive during periods when you feel professionally uncertain or personally inadequate, as your mind fights to maintain the vigilant productivity that supposedly validates your existence. Scientific research confirms that self-worth perception significantly impacts sleep quality. with lower self-esteem correlating with increased sleep disturbances and reduced sleep efficiency. When your sense of value depends on external validation and measurable achievements, your nervous system remains in a heightened state of alertness, monitoring for threats to your perceived worth. This physiological state interferes with the natural wind-down process that should precede sleep, keeping cortisol levels elevated and melatonin production suppressed. The creation narrative presents a different paradigm, where humanity's value derives from being made in God's likeness, rather than from any functional capacity or productive output. This inherent worth exists before any action is taken, established by divine declaration rather than human accomplishment. The same God who declared creation good without requiring proof of productivity affirms your value without demanding evidence of achievement. Being made in God's image means your worth is inherent, not earned, freeing you to rest without guilt or anxiety about temporarily suspending productive activity. This understanding transforms sleep from a necessary interruption of your worth validation process to a natural rhythm within your identity as a valued being. Your rest becomes not a sign of laziness, but an affirmation of your inherent worth, independent of what you produce. This shift from performance-based identity to inherent worth changes your relationship with time itself, particularly the hours designated for restoration. When your value isn't contingent on constant doing, the shift toward being, whether in wakefulness or sleep, becomes not a loss but an integration of your full humanity. The pressure to achieve relaxes its grip on your consciousness, allowing your mind and body to enter states of restoration without the underlying fear that you're wasting valuable productivity time. The Genesis account states, "Let us make man in our likeness," establishing that humanity's primary purpose is reflective relationship rather than independent achievement. This foundational identity creates the conditions for true rest, where cessation of activity doesn't threaten your sense of worth, but rather aligns with your created nature as someone who receives value rather than earns it through striving. This understanding of inherent worth establishes the foundation for how humanity would relate to the rest of creation, including the vegetation that had been provided for sustenance. The relationship between identity and provision becomes clear when worth is detached from productivity, creating a paradigm where receiving what is given becomes natural rather than something that must be earned through labor. The Genesis account reveals something unexpected about the original creation. Humans and animals were given plants alone for food, establishing a world where life sustained life without predation or violence. The text explicitly states, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all that crawls on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it. I give every green plant for food." This original diet represents a harmonious ecosystem where provision required no struggle or taking of life, creating a paradigm of peaceful sustenance that stands in stark contrast to the post-fall reality of predation and competition. Your modern eating habits often reflect deep anxieties about provision that keep you from experiencing this original harmony. You might find yourself worrying about food choices, meal timing, or whether you have enough nutritious options available. This constant mental engagement with sustenance creates a low-level anxiety that activates your sympathetic nervous system, keeping your body in a state of alertness even when you should be winding down for rest. The need to plan, procure, and prepare food becomes another source of striving rather than an opportunity to receive what has been provided. Scientific research confirms that meal timing and content significantly affect sleep quality, with late meals, heavy foods, or nutritional imbalances disrupting natural sleep patterns. When you eat too close to bedtime, your body must divert energy to digestion rather than restoration, interfering with the natural decline in metabolic activity that should accompany sleep preparation. The anxiety about what to eat or whether you've eaten properly creates psychological stress that further impedes your ability to relax into restorative rest. This original dietary provision establishes that rest becomes possible when you trust in peaceful provision rather than striving to secure sustenance through effort or anxiety. The preemptive creation of vegetation before any creatures existed to consume it demonstrates that God's provision operates through abundance and foresight rather than reaction to need. This paradigm of receiving rather than striving challenges the modern mindset that treats food as something to be earned, managed, or worried about, rather than received as gift. The shift to animal consumption after the flood represents a departure from this original harmony, introducing a reality where life sustains itself through taking other life. This post-fall condition mirrors your own experience of provision requiring effort, competition, and sometimes struggle. The anxiety this generates about having enough, choosing rightly, or managing resources keeps your nervous system engaged in vigilant protection mode rather than receptive restoration mode. The initial plant-based diet reveals God's perfect provision without violence, establishing that true sustenance comes through receiving what is given rather than taking what is needed. This understanding transforms your relationship with food from a source of anxiety to an opportunity to practice trust in divine provision. When you approach meals with gratitude rather than calculation, with reception rather than anxiety, you align yourself with the original harmonious relationship between creature and creation. This paradigm of peaceful provision directly impacts your ability to rest, as trust in adequate sustenance allows your nervous system to relax its vigilant monitoring of resources. The connection between food anxiety and sleep disruption demonstrates how deeply your physical restoration depends on your psychological trust in provision. Embracing the original dietary model of receiving, rather than striving, creates the internal conditions necessary for both peaceful eating and restorative sleeping. The harmonious provision of vegetation established that completion and rest follow adequate sustenance rather than exhausting effort to secure it. After bringing humanity into being, God surveyed the full span of creation and declared everything he had made very good. This final declaration, expressed in Hebrew as Tov Mi'od, represents the ultimate affirmation of completion and inherent perfection. The phrase carries a weight of finality and satisfaction, marking not just adequacy, but a state of ideal harmony where every element exists in right relationship to the whole. This divine assessment stands as a permanent testimony to creation's inherent worth and purposeful design. You live in a world that rarely acknowledges completion, where the mindset of perpetual improvement and endless optimization leaves little room for declaring anything truly finished. Your work projects extend beyond their deadlines, your personal goals shift constantly, and your mental checklist never reaches a point of satisfactory conclusion. This cultural conditioning toward continuous striving creates a state of underlying dissatisfaction that makes genuine rest nearly impossible to achieve. The pressure to always do more and be more prevents you from recognizing when something has reached its proper completion. Perfectionism fuels this inability to acknowledge completion, creating a state of constant mental agitation that directly interferes with sleep. Scientific research confirms that perfectionistic tendencies significantly correlate with sleep disorders, as the mind remains engaged in endless evaluation and criticism of perceived flaws and unfinished business. The drive for flawless performance keeps your nervous system in a heightened state of alertness, monitoring for potential improvements and analyzing previous efforts, rather than allowing the natural wind-down process that should precede sleep. The divine declaration of very good establishes that completion precedes rest rather than exhaustion. God did not rest because he was tired from creative labor, but because the work was perfectly finished and fully worthy of cessation. This sequence challenges the human pattern of working until collapse, instead presenting rest as the natural consequence of recognized completion rather than physical depletion. The theological principle here is that rest follows affirmation, not fatigue. This understanding transforms your relationship with both work and rest, suggesting that peace comes from recognizing when something has reached its proper completion rather than from pushing yourself to the point of exhaustion. The divine model shows that worth is established before rest begins, creating a foundation of satisfaction that makes true cessation possible. Your struggle to sleep often stems from the inability to declare your day's work good enough and release it from further evaluation or improvement. The phrase "tov miodeye" appears only rarely in the Old Testament, reserved for moments of profound and absolute goodness. Its application to the entirety of creation establishes that perfection was an intrinsic quality of God's finished work, not something requiring ongoing human effort or adjustment. This theological reality offers a counter-narrative to the modern drive for constant self-improvement, suggesting that your value and the value of your work exist independently of perpetual achievement. God's satisfaction with completed creation establishes the necessary conditions for what would follow, the seventh day of rest that stands apart as a sanctified time of cessation. The declaration of very good creates the theological foundation for Sabbath observance, where rest becomes not an interruption of work, but its divinely intended culmination. This pattern demonstrates that true completion makes rest possible rather than rest being merely the absence of work. The connection between perfectionism and sleep disorders reveals how the inability to accept good enough keeps your mind trapped in evaluation mode, preventing the mental quiet necessary for restorative sleep. When you cannot declare your efforts complete and satisfactory, your nervous system remains engaged in problem-solving and improvement strategies that interfere with natural sleep initiation. The divine pattern of declaration followed by rest offers an alternative approach where recognition of completeness enables true cessation. The seventh day stands apart from the pattern of the first six, marked not by divine action but by divine cessation. After declaring creation complete, God rested on the seventh day from all his work of creating, establishing a fundamental distinction between days of doing and this day dedicated to being within the completeness of what had been accomplished. Unlike the previous days bounded by evening and morning, the seventh day carries no such temporal markers, suggesting a quality of time that transcends ordinary cycles and enters sacred space. Your life likely operates with little distinction between days of activity and potential days of rest, as the constant availability of digital engagement and work obligations erases boundaries that should separate striving from cessation. You might fill what could be moments of true rest with productivity tasks, entertainment consumption, or mental planning that maintains the same psychological state as active work. This inability to genuinely stop reveals how deeply conditioned you've become to constant activity, where stillness feels uncomfortable rather than restorative. The distinction between true cessation and passive entertainment matters for your well-being. Entertainment often provides stimulation that keeps your sympathetic nervous system engaged, even when you appear to be relaxing. Watching screens, scrolling through content, or even listening to stimulating music maintains a state of low-level arousal that prevents the deep restoration offered by genuine cessation. Your body remains in a state of readiness, rather than entering the parasympathetic dominance required for true recovery. Scientific research confirms that true cessation activates different neurological responses than passive entertainment. When you completely cease activity, your brain transitions into default mode network activity that facilitates memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creative insight. This state differs significantly from the cognitive engagement maintained during entertainment consumption, where your mind remains in reception mode rather than integration mode. The parasympathetic nervous system activation during true rest lowers cortisol levels, reduces inflammation, and facilitates cellular repair in ways that passive entertainment cannot replicate. The seventh day reveals rest as a positive state of being rather than merely the absence of work. God's rest wasn't exhaustion but satisfaction, a cessation that emerged from completion rather than fatigue. This understanding transforms rest from something you collapse into after effort to something you enter as the natural culmination of recognized completion. The divine model shows that cessation becomes possible when work has been declared complete rather than merely abandoned. This qualitative difference in the seventh day establishes that time itself can be sanctified, set apart for purposes beyond productivity and achievement. The blessing and sanctification of this day created a template for how all time could be viewed. not as a resource to be managed, but as a gift to be received within its proper boundaries and purposes. The seventh day becomes not an interruption of creation, but its intended culmination, the space where the meaning and value of the work can be fully appreciated. The shift from doing to being represented by the seventh day offers a paradigm for your own approach to rest, suggesting that your value exists independently of your productivity. When you learn to exist without constant activity, you align yourself with the divine pattern where being precedes doing and worth exists before work begins. This transformation in perspective allows you to enter rest not as an escape from work, but as participation in the completeness of what has been accomplished. The seventh day establishes that rest is not passive emptiness, but active engagement with peace, satisfaction, and the recognition of inherent goodness. This understanding creates the foundation for viewing time as sanctified space rather than managed resource, transforming your relationship with both work and rest from one of scarcity to one of abundance. The divine cessation on the seventh day completes the creative pattern, establishing that rest is the intended culmination of work rather than its interruption. This completion creates the necessary conditions for what follows: the sanctification of time itself as holy space rather than economic commodity. On the seventh day, God blessed the time itself and made it holy, setting apart this day as sacred space for communion rather than continuation of work. This divine act of sanctification applies not to physical objects or locations, but to time itself, transforming ordinary duration into sacred opportunity for connection with the divine presence. The blessing and sanctification establish that time can carry spiritual significance beyond its practical utility, becoming a vessel for experiencing God's presence rather than merely a resource to be managed or consumed. You likely view time through the lens of modern productivity culture, treating hours as commodities to be maximized and moments as opportunities for achievement. This perception of time as scarce resource creates constant anxiety about wasting it or not using it efficiently enough. You might feel guilty about periods of inactivity, restless during moments of stillness, and compelled to fill every available minute with measurable productivity. This commodified view of time prevents you from experiencing it as sacred space, turning what could be moments of communion into sources of stress about optimal utilization. Rarely do you treat time as sacred space, setting aside periods specifically for spiritual connection without agenda or measurable outcome. Your days likely flow without clear boundaries between sacred and secular time, with spiritual practices squeezed between other obligations rather than given their own sanctified space. The absence of intentionally set-apart time reflects the modern tendency to view all time as neutral territory, available for optimization rather than recognizing certain periods as specially designated for divine encounter. Scientific research confirms that ritual, observance, and the perception of time as sacred significantly impact psychological well-being. When you establish regular rhythms of sacred time through intentional practices, it creates psychological boundaries that reduce anxiety and increase overall life satisfaction. The act of designating specific times as set apart for spiritual purposes activates different neural pathways than those engaged during routine productivity, facilitating states of peace and connection that counter the stress responses triggered by time pressure. The perception of time as sacred rather than scarce transforms your relationship with both work and rest, creating a framework where all time becomes God's gift rather than your possession to manage anxiously. This shift in perspective allows you to receive time as provision rather than defend it as limited resource, reducing the urgency that drives overwork and sleep-disrupting anxiety. The understanding that time is given rather than taken changes how you approach both waking hours and resting hours. Sanctified time means all moments exist within God's provision rather than under your anxious management, creating the psychological safety needed for true rest. When you recognize time as gift rather than possession, the pressure to optimize every minute relaxes, allowing your nervous system to transition from vigilant control to receptive trust. This transformation in time perception directly impacts your ability to sleep. as the anxiety about wasted time or insufficient productivity no longer hijacks your evening hours. The divine act of blessing and sanctifying the seventh day establishes that time itself can become holy ground, space set apart for experiencing God's presence rather than accomplishing human objectives. This understanding invites you to view your own time, including your sleeping hours, as potential sacred space rather than neutral territory to be filled with activity. The sanctification of time creates the foundation for receiving rest as gift rather than achieving it as reward. This transformation in how you perceive and experience time prepares you to understand rest not as something you earn through exhaustion, but as something you receive through trust in God's provision. The sanctification of the seventh day creates the theological framework for viewing all time as gift, establishing that your worth and security exist independently of how productively you use your hours. This shift from anxious management to grateful reception changes everything about your relationship with time, work, and rest. Divine rest came after God declared creation complete, not because he was exhausted from his work. This establishes rest as something to be received rather than earned, a gift given after fulfillment rather than a reward for effort. The Genesis account presents cessation as the natural culmination of work that has been declared good, creating a paradigm where rest emerges from completion rather than collapse. You live within an achievement economy that measures your worth by what you produce and views rest as something to be earned through sufficient tiredness. This mindset leads you to treat sleep as a reward for exhaustion rather than a gift to be received. You might push yourself to complete one more task, stay awake a little longer, or achieve a certain level of fatigue before feeling justified in resting. This performance-based approach to sleep creates a relationship where you must prove your deservingness through exhaustion. The attempt to earn sleep through tiredness often backfires, creating a state of hyper-arousal that prevents the very rest you seek. When you approach sleep as something to be achieved rather than received, your nervous system remains in striving mode, monitoring for the right moment when you've done enough to warrant cessation. This constant evaluation keeps your sympathetic nervous system engaged, releasing stress hormones that interfere with natural sleep initiation. Performance anxiety significantly impacts your ability to fall asleep by maintaining a state of mental vigilance that conflicts with the relaxation required for sleep onset. The pressure to achieve sufficient tiredness or prove your worth through productivity creates racing thoughts about whether you've done enough to deserve rest. This mental activity stimulates brain regions associated with goal-directed behavior and evaluation, preventing the shift into the default mode network activity that facilitates sleep transition. Scientific research confirms that the neurological basis of receiving differs fundamentally from striving brain states. Striving activates the sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response, characterized by heightened alertness and increased heart rate. Receiving engages the parasympathetic nervous system's rest and digest response, promoting relaxation and reduced physiological arousal. The shift from striving to receiving is essential for transitioning into sleep, yet your achievement orientation often prevents this necessary neurological transition. Understanding rest as gift rather than reward liberates you from the need to deserve it through tiredness. When you recognize sleep as divine endowment rather than earned privilege, the pressure to prove your worth through exhaustion diminishes. This perspective allows you to release the performance anxiety that keeps you vigilant about whether you've done enough to warrant rest, creating space for genuine cessation to occur. The transformation from striving to receiving changes everything about your approach to sleep, allowing you to enter rest as an act of trust rather than an achievement of exhaustion. This shift acknowledges that your worth exists independently of your productivity level or fatigue state, creating the psychological safety needed for your nervous system to transition into parasympathetic dominance. The acceptance of rest as gift rather than reward creates the conditions for true physiological restoration to begin. This understanding of rest as divine gift establishes the foundation for how your body responds to the invitation to cease striving and start receiving. The liberation from performance-based rest allows your entire being to shift from achievement orientation to receptive trust, creating the neurological and physiological conditions necessary for sleep to occur naturally rather than through forced exhaustion. Your body knows two distinct physiological states, striving and receiving, that directly impact your ability to rest. The sympathetic nervous system governs striving, creating the fight or flight response that increases heart rate, elevates blood pressure, and maintains muscle tension. This state of heightened alertness serves you well during waking hours, but becomes the primary obstacle to sleep when it persists into the evening. The parasympathetic nervous system controls receiving, facilitating the rest and digest functions that slow your heart rate, reduce blood pressure, and allow your body to enter restorative states. This fundamental physiological distinction determines whether you experience sleep as struggle or gift. When you attempt to sleep through striving, you engage the very system that prevents rest. You might notice racing thoughts, physical restlessness, or frustration about not sleeping, all symptoms of sympathetic activation. The effort to force sleep creates a counterproductive cycle where the striving itself maintains the alertness that blocks natural sleep onset. This physiological battle manifests as tension in your jaw, tightness in your shoulders, or constant mental calculations about how much sleep you might lose. Scientific research confirms that parasympathetic nervous system activation significantly improves sleep quality by facilitating the transition into deeper sleep stages essential for physical and mental restoration. Chronic sympathetic activation disrupts natural sleep architecture, leading to fragmented sleep and reduced restorative quality. The shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance allows your body to engage in cellular repair, memory consolidation, and emotional processing that occur during true rest. Spiritual rest affects physiological rest through this neurological pathway. When you approach sleep as something to receive rather than achieve, you signal safety to your nervous system, allowing parasympathetic activation to occur naturally. The theological understanding of rest as gift rather than reward creates the psychological conditions that facilitate this physiological shift. Your body responds to trust by reducing cortisol production and increasing heart rate variability, creating the internal environment sleep requires. Sabbath rest begins with accepting that restoration is received, not achieved through exhaustion or effort. This mental posture shifts your focus from personal striving to divine provision, quieting the sympathetic nervous system's drive to perform and allowing the parasympathetic system to engage. The physiological manifestation of trust enables genuine restoration rather than continued vigilance. This understanding transforms your relationship with sleep from a performance to be mastered to a gift to be received. The shift from striving to receiving changes how your body responds to the invitation to rest, creating the neurological conditions for sleep to occur naturally. Your worth exists independently of your ability to achieve sleep, allowing your nervous system to transition from effort to acceptance. The healing of time begins when you recognize that restoration operates through reception rather than achievement. This transformation in perception changes how your body experiences both waking and sleeping hours, creating patterns of trust that facilitate parasympathetic activation. The same principle that governs spiritual rest applies to physiological restoration. Both emerge from receiving rather than striving. Your perception of time as a scarce resource shapes how you experience both waking hours and the struggle for sleep at night. When time feels limited, it creates a constant sense of urgency that keeps your mind racing even when your body needs rest. The anxiety about unfinished tasks, looming deadlines, or simply the feeling that time is slipping away can manifest as insomnia, where your thoughts refuse to settle into the quiet necessary for sleep. This perception of time scarcity activates your sympathetic nervous system, maintaining a state of alertness that conflicts with the relaxation required for restorative rest. The divine economy offers a different framework where time operates as abundant provision rather than limited commodity. The creation narrative establishes time as a gift structured with purposeful rhythm. days and nights, seasons and years, all existing within God's generous provision rather than human scarcity. This theological understanding transforms time from something you must anxiously manage into something you can gratefully receive. The blessing and sanctification of the seventh day in Genesis 2:1-3 model this shift, presenting time as holy space rather than economic resource. Scientific research confirms that time perception significantly influences anxiety levels and sleep quality. When you view time as scarce, your brain remains in a state of heightened vigilance, monitoring for potential threats to your schedule or productivity. This constant mental engagement interferes with the natural wind-down process that should precede sleep, keeping cortisol levels elevated and melatonin production suppressed. The feeling of time pressure creates physiological conditions that directly oppose the parasympathetic activation needed for rest. Historical Sabbath practices demonstrate how setting apart sacred time can heal this anxious relationship with time's passage. The deliberate cessation from productive activity, as modeled in Genesis, creates a psychological boundary that separates time from performance demands. This practice reorients your perception from scarcity to abundance by demonstrating that time remains God's provision rather than your possession to manage. The ritual of setting apart time for rest reinforces that your worth exists independently of your productivity during that time. Sanctified time transforms your experience of time from enemy to gift, reducing the urgency that disrupts sleep. When you receive time as divine provision rather than defend it as limited resource, the pressure to optimize every minute relaxes its grip on your consciousness. This shift allows your nervous system to transition from vigilant control to receptive trust, creating the internal conditions necessary for sleep initiation and maintenance. The transformation in time perception changes how you approach both work and rest, viewing them as complementary rhythms rather than competing priorities. The healing of your relationship with time through Sabbath practice creates space for practical rest to emerge naturally rather than through forced effort. This reorientation from scarcity to abundance in time perception establishes the foundation for implementing simple practices that honor time as gift rather than commodity. The psychological safety created by viewing time as abundant provision allows your body to enter states of restoration without the underlying anxiety about wasting precious moments. Your body carries a striving posture even as you lie in bed, maintaining muscle tension and mental vigilance that signals to your nervous system that rest remains something to be achieved rather than received. You might clench your jaw, tighten your shoulders, or hold your breath while waiting for sleep to come, creating physical resistance to the very relaxation you seek. This striving posture keeps your sympathetic nervous system engaged, preventing the parasympathetic activation necessary for sleep initiation. Your physical stance communicates urgency rather than receptivity, effort rather than surrender. The contrast between striving and receiving postures becomes evident in how you approach sleep itself. Striving posture involves actively trying to force sleep through mental effort, physical repositioning, or monitoring sleep metrics. Receiving posture involves accepting wakefulness while remaining open to sleep as a gift that comes when conditions are right. One posture fights against your current state, while the other accepts it with trust that rest will come in its proper time. The difference appears subtle, but carries profound implications for your nervous system's response. Scientific research confirms that body posture directly influences nervous system states and sleep quality. When you maintain a tense, alert posture, your brain receives signals that reinforce sympathetic activation. Adopting an open, relaxed posture sends different signals that facilitate parasympathetic dominance. Studies show that conscious relaxation of muscle groups, proper spinal alignment, and diaphragmatic breathing all contribute to the physiological shift from striving to receiving states. This postural shift isn't merely physical, but represents a whole person reorientation toward trust rather than control. The fundamental shift from striving to receiving represents the physiological manifestation of trust in God's provision and completed work. Just as God rested after declaring creation complete rather than exhausted, your body can learn to rest from a place of satisfaction rather than collapse. This postural transformation allows your nervous system to transition from vigilant protection to receptive restoration, creating the internal conditions necessary for sleep to occur naturally, rather than through forced effort. This shift affects sleep quality by facilitating the neurological transition from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. When your posture communicates receptivity rather than striving, your brain reduces cortisol production and increases melatonin release. Heart rate variability improves, indicating greater parasympathetic influence, while muscle tension decreases, allowing for deeper physical relaxation. The quality of your sleep architecture improves as you spend more time in restorative deep sleep and REM stages rather than in light, easily disrupted sleep. The postural shift from striving to receiving enables practical implementation of Sabbath principles in your nightly routine. Simple physical adjustments, conscious relaxation of facial muscles, intentional slowing of breathing, adoption of open rather than defensive sleeping positions can facilitate the neurological transition from effort to acceptance. These practical postural changes create a feedback loop where your body's position reinforces your mind's trust in divine provision rather than personal striving. When wakefulness visits your night and sleep remains distant, this experience can become sanctified time rather than failed rest. The frustration that accompanies insomnia often stems from viewing wakefulness as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity for connection. Your struggle against sleeplessness creates a battle where the very effort to sleep maintains the alertness that prevents it, increasing anxiety about rest and creating a cycle of performance pressure that conflicts with natural sleep rhythms. Historical Christian practices of night watch prayer reframe wakefulness as sacred space for spiritual communion rather than wasted time. This tradition understands the night hours as uniquely suited for prayer, meditation, and attentive listening to the divine. The Genesis narrative's repeated affirmation that God saw his creation as very good establishes a foundation for accepting wakefulness as part of that goodness, rather than a deviation from it. This theological perspective transforms insomnia from affliction to invitation. Scientific research on acceptance-based approaches to insomnia treatment confirms that struggling against unwanted thoughts or sensations intensifies them. The effort to force sleep activates your sympathetic nervous system, increasing heart rate and racing thoughts that are counterproductive to rest, acceptance, and commitment. Therapy principles demonstrate that acknowledging wakefulness without judgment reduces the distress associated with insomnia, creating conditions more conducive to sleep by disengaging the stress response. Your fight against insomnia often manifests as mental resistance to the present moment, where you criticize yourself for not sleeping and anxiously monitor the passing hours. This internal battle keeps your body in a state of heightened alertness, releasing cortisol and adrenaline that directly interfere with the relaxation required for sleep. The frustration with wakefulness becomes a self-perpetuating cycle where the desire for sleep prevents its occurrence. Accepting wakefulness as potential sacred space rather than failed rest transforms your relationship with the night hours. This shift involves releasing the performance pressure to achieve sleep and instead embracing the present moment as an opportunity for communion. The same divine presence that sanctified the seventh day of rest can sanctify your wakeful nights, transforming them from anxious waiting to purposeful being. Theological reframing of wakefulness encourages viewing insomnia through the lens of divine purpose rather than personal deficiency. This perspective fosters receptivity and surrender to the present moment, releasing the struggle against what is and opening to what might be offered in these quiet hours. The paradox of this approach is that by accepting wakefulness, you create the psychological conditions that often lead naturally to sleep. Sanctifying your wakefulness transforms insomnia from battle to invitation for deeper rest that extends beyond physical sleep. This transformation occurs through shifting your focus from controlling sleep to engaging with the present moment as holy time. The night watch becomes not a vigil for sleep to come, but an opportunity for spiritual focus and listening presence. This acceptance-based approach aligns with the Genesis pattern where God declared completion and goodness before resting, not from exhaustion but from satisfaction. Embracing wakefulness as potentially sacred space prepares you for practical Sabbath keeping that incorporates this transformed perspective into nightly routines. The shift from frustration to acceptance creates the foundation for implementing simple practices that honor both wakefulness and sleep as gifts rather than achievements. Your nightly routine often becomes another performance checklist, another series of tasks to accomplish in pursuit of sleep. You might measure room temperature, track blue light exposure, time your caffeine intake, and follow complex sleep hygiene protocols that turn rest into another achievement to master. This approach maintains the striving mentality that prevents genuine rest, keeping your nervous system engaged in the very effort that blocks sleep. Simple Sabbath practices at bedtime shift the focus from achieving sleep to receiving it as gift. Begin by consciously declaring the day complete, acknowledging that whatever was accomplished or left undone is now finished. Speak aloud, "It is good," or "It is complete," echoing the divine declaration over creation. This verbal acknowledgement signals to your nervous system that striving can cease, creating psychological closure that facilitates the transition to rest. Research confirms that ritual and routine significantly improve sleep quality by creating predictable patterns that signal safety to your brain. Consistent bedtime rituals reduce sleep onset latency and increase sleep efficiency by establishing cues that prepare your body for rest. The neurological response to ritual decreases cortisol production and increases melatonin release, creating the physiological conditions necessary for sleep. These effects occur not through complex protocols, but through simple, repeated practices that create psychological safety. Create a brief ending ritual that marks the transition from day to night. Light a candle to represent God's presence in your wakefulness and rest. Then extinguish it with a prayer of release. Place your hand over your heart and breathe slowly, acknowledging that your worth exists independently of today's accomplishments or tomorrow's demands. Recite a simple phrase like, "I receive this night as gift," or "My value is declared good before I rest." Practice breath prayer as you lie down, using the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation as a physical manifestation of receiving rather than striving. With each breath in, silently acknowledge you provide, and with each breath out, release I receive. This intentional breathing pattern activates your parasympathetic nervous system, facilitating the physiological shift from effort to acceptance that sleep requires. Keep a gratitude journal by your bedside, writing one thing from the day that was good, in the divine sense, not necessarily perfect, but containing inherent value. This practice aligns your perception with God's declaration of goodness over creation, training your mind to recognize completion rather than deficiency. Research shows that gratitude practice before bed improves sleep quality by reducing anxious thoughts and increasing positive emotions that facilitate relaxation. Set apart your sleeping space as sanctified time by removing productivity reminders and sleep tracking devices that reinforce performance anxiety. Create a physical environment that communicates receptivity rather than striving, soft lighting, comfortable positioning, and intentional release of muscle tension. The physical posture of open-handed receiving rather than clenched striving reinforces the neurological shift toward parasympathetic activation. Small Sabbath practices at bedtime transform your entire sleep experience from anxious striving to peaceful receiving. These simple rituals create the psychological and physiological conditions that allow sleep to come naturally rather than through forced effort. The shift from complex sleep hygiene to simple Sabbath receptivity changes your relationship with both wakefulness and rest. This practical implementation of Sabbath principles prepares you to embrace your inherent worth as established before rest begins. Your value operates on a different economy than your achievements. The Genesis account establishes that humanity's worth derives from being created in God's image, an inherent quality bestowed rather than earned through performance. This divine declaration of goodness applies directly to your worth, meaning your value exists before you accomplish anything and remains constant regardless of productivity levels. The text states, "God created mankind in his own image. establishing that your identity originates in divine likeness rather than human achievement. Conditional self-worth keeps you measuring your value by daily accomplishments, creating anxiety when rest threatens to suspend your ability to prove your significance. You lie awake, calculating whether you did enough to deserve rest, whether today's productivity justifies tomorrow's opportunities, whether your output measures up to some undefined standard of worthiness. This performance-based evaluation activates your sympathetic nervous system, releasing stress hormones that directly interfere with sleep initiation and maintenance. Unconditional divine affirmation operates differently. God declared creation very good before any human activity occurred, establishing that worth precedes work and value exists independent of validation. This theological reality means your significance derives from whose you are rather than what you do, from divine declaration rather than human accomplishment. The same affirmation that established creation's goodness applies to your inherent worth as God's image bearer. Worth anxiety disrupts sleep by maintaining mental vigilance about whether you've achieved enough to warrant rest. Your mind replays the day's conversations, evaluates unfinished tasks, and worries about tomorrow's demands, creating a state of constant assessment that prevents the psychological closure necessary for sleep. This internal performance review keeps your brain engaged in evaluation mode rather than transitioning to the default mode, network activity that facilitates rest. Scientific research confirms that self-worth perception significantly correlates with sleep quality. Individuals who base their value on external achievements experience more sleep disturbances and reduced sleep efficiency compared to those with inherent self-worth. The neurological mechanism involves increased amygdala activation and decreased prefrontal cortex activity, creating emotional arousal that conflicts with relaxation. This pattern demonstrates how conditional self-worth creates physiological conditions incompatible with restorative rest. Accepting your inherent worth as God's creation allows rest without performance anxiety because it decouples your value from your productivity. When you internalize that your significance exists before you work and continues through rest, the pressure to achieve justification for cessation diminishes. This psychological shift facilitates the neurological transition from sympathetic alertness to parasympathetic relaxation, creating the conditions sleep requires. The resolution comes through embracing that your worth is declared good before you rest, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of whose you are. This acceptance transforms rest from something you must earn through exhaustion to something you can receive as your birthright as God's image bearer. The freedom from performance-based worth allows your nervous system to release its vigilant monitoring of your productivity level. This understanding prepares you to receive the final invitation that the same God who rested after declaring creation complete offers rest as gift rather than reward. The divine pattern establishes that cessation follows affirmation rather than exhaustion, creating a paradigm where your worth enables rest rather than rest threatening your worth. The same God who rested after declaring creation complete invites you to receive rest as sanctified gift rather than earned reward. Let these ancient words reshape your relationship with time, work, and worth tonight as you speak them into your wakefulness. The command to be still becomes an invitation to stop striving and start receiving the support already being given. Receive this rest not through exhaustion but through trust in what has been declared complete. Allow your breathing to become the prayer that welcomes what is offered rather than demands what is earned.